Hello everybody, my name is Kate, and today we're going to be building some cool effects from Stargate Atlantis. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I recommend you either talk to somebody who grew up in the late 90s or early 2000s. If you've ever watched the Sci-Fi channel, Space, now rebranded as CTV Sci-Fi channel, you'll know that there was a few popular series called Stargate on that channel. There were a lot of shows named Stargate, Stargate SG-1, Stargate Infinity, Stargate Universe, etc. But the one we're focusing on today is Stargate Atlantis. This is the one I like personally, it's my favorite. So we're gonna develop some effects from the show and try and replicate them to the best of our abilities. I'm gonna be walking you through a setup that I did. It's fairly simple. I figured we'd start off with an easy effect, which is like a beam up effect, and how you can do it in two different ways. So let's get started. So as you can see over here, I already have my lights in my scene. I have a distant light. You can take a look at it here. The transform is this. The area light is just placed in the scene above here just to give it a extra kind of dimension, I guess you could call it that. And it's translated to that. You don't have to get it exactly, it's entirely up to you. Environment light, it's an environment light. It's using the default, one of the default HDRIs in Houdini. Camera in the scene, if we zoom through it, it's just a far away close-up. So those are the transformations for it. I haven't really changed anything on here. That's how it came on in the scene. And then over here I have my render nodes. So there's three parts to this project. There's the ground glow. So when the beam strikes the ground, it has a glow to it. There's a render beam option. And then I've added a little person so you can see for scale how big this thing is. In the show, this effect, this beam up effect, usually comes from a spaceship skimming across the surface of a planet and picking people up. If you've seen the show, you know it's a Wraith ship. So the beam is quite big if you think about it to scale, if we were actually going to do it, depending how high the ship is up in the air. So forgive my scale if it's not entirely accurate. But I'm going to render everything together just so you guys can see a general idea. I have 3 render passes, one each for the ground glow and the person. But if we render this all together, we can see that it all fits together in the scene. Alright, so while it's rendering, I'll talk about what's happening. So, the glassy effect on the beam, it doesn't look like anything you want it to look like, but I swear once you start to comp it, it'll make a lot of sense. You can see the glow on the ground, and you can't really see the person inside of it because this is a opaque material. But you kind of get what I'm talking about with the general shape of it. So let's dive into the setup and get started. So as we can see, I have some materials over here, and I'm going to show you which ones are which. I tested on a lot, so pardon me if they are not entirely accurate. So for the ground glow, it's a simple glow shader. So if we jump to it, it's right over here, and I'll rename it ground glow just for you. So, and I'll also hit L so we can find everything a lot more easily. So you can see that the glow ramp rate is turned off. The enable emission is a 2. And that's pretty much everything to that shader. So if we jump back out, we can go to the render beam, and it's got a principal shader on it. The principal shader was the most easiest way to go about it. Billowy smoke, all the other options weren't that great. So I'll explain that in a second of how I'm gonna just delete the ones I don't need. So there should only really be 2 or 3 shaders here. So yes, principal shader number 1 was this. So I'm just gonna rename this beam so we understand that this is the beam one. The surface got this lovely base color. I'm not going to pronounce every single number for you, but you can see that is this little kind of gray-blue color. The IOR is 3, so it's really reflective. So is the reflectivity on that. The transparency is cranked up because in the show, if you ever watch it, you want to see the person going up in the beam, right? So it's partially transparent, but it's also really reflective. The dispersion is on it as well, so we can have that kind of rainbow effect go through the beam. And the surface priority is also a 1. Subsurface scattering's on there as well. So I was trying to mimic water without having a kind of water effect to it, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So it's got the dispersion of the water, but it's not blue like the water. It's just like kind of transparency blue. So we've got subsurface scattering, that is blue as well. There's no emission. Opacity, nothing's changed there, but I did turn on fake casustics because I felt like I got a better result with that. So now we go to the render person matte. This is just for your preference. Basically, if you have an animated character, this is where you plug him into the simulation. So I've just added a principal shader. I really haven't changed much for this, so I'm just gonna... Houdini, stop. Person. This is pretty much the same, only that the reflectivity and the IOR are toned down, as well as the roughness. So you kind of get a kind of matted out person. You could even add like the matte shader on this as well, so you get a shape. But I found in comp, I still wanted to see some features of the person, so I could highlight which parts bring attention to the areas of the character that are getting beamed up in this effect. So a principal shader worked best for me. You could also use a matte shader. So I'm gonna go back to the start of my timeline. You can see it cooking away. And we'll dive inside. So going up to the build beam, you can see that it's a tiny setup. It looks a little bit complicated, but we'll get to it. So I'm going to go up here again and turn off all my render layers. And I'm going to start with a circle. I'm also going to turn off my lighting because I don't really need it right now. So I've got a circle and I've transformed it up. So the center of it is 8.9 meters in the air. I've also animated this and I've given it a division size of 12. So over time, basically, this is animated. So the circle expands and then it also shrinks over time. So if you pause it, the final keyframe is 0. Up here, it's 1, 1, an in-between frame, so 0.3, and it starts at 0.2. Pretty much makes sense from there. And it's tilted from the XZ plane. I've then scattered some points, because I thought that was the best way, generating by density, and then I've added a pop net. So you can see already there's a ground plane in here. I'll get to that in a second. But if we dive inside, we've got our first source input, which is has a constant birth rate of 1,000 points, life expectancy of 0, a pop force with these settings, so an amplitude of 1.21, pop drag of 0.2. That's going into a pop solver. You can probably turn off this ground group. It didn't really work for me, but I just labeled it ground. This is the only thing I did to the solver. Pop object, use transform is turned on. Keep that in mind. And I added a wind force with a -4 in the y-axis and a scale force of 23. I added some gravity because you want everything to fall to the ground. And then we have our collisions. So before I get into the collisions, I'm just going to play it for you so you can kind of get a general idea of what I'm going for. So as it's simming out, you can already see that the flow isn't that great for it, and you can see it condensing into this line. And I'll talk about that after the simulation's passed, simply because it's kind of up to you where you can take the simulation from here. But this gave me the general shape and form of the beam that I wanted. So for the floor, if we go over here to our static solver, it's a static object, and I've just renamed the static object build beam. just so I know it's like the one I want to use. Display geometry. Once you turn off and then turn this back on, you'll see a lovely floor. And it's using a volume sample. Bullet data, you don't really need it. And it's by size. And that's pretty much it. All the offset surfaces are turned off. And it has a link to the proxy volume. So basically what I did, and I'll show you, because I'll do this again just to show you. Up here I generated a grid on the floor of my kind of plane-like area. I made it large because I didn't know if I wanted the beam to travel at the time. But then it just kind of worked, so I kept it. There's a poly extrude, so I extruded it down, as you can see from the settings, and I also outputted it back. So you've got a lovely kind of grid box going there. I've got out ground null, and that's where I start. So as you can see, I pre-generated this from a shelf tool, and I'll show you how I did that. So with this null selected, I dived into my popnet, and then I jumped up to the surface, and I hit static objects. And you can see something happened because my sim just yelled at me. And if we dive inside here, you can already see that it's already created some VBDs. And you can see it also plugged into here. So that's how I created the collider. And we'll just delete the collider because we don't really need it anymore. But that's how I did it. And now, jumping back to the simulation, we can play it back. We can see that this is just heading down, which is great. But then we also see our floor. So I've added, there's two ways to do this. I have my own way. It's just more reliable. You can actually choose which objects you want to cut out from here. At this point it's showing all objects, but I like to add a delete node and just selectively delete what I want from my simulation. So here I've selected the stream source first inputs, selected this to points, and chose delete non-selected. So it's deleting the floor. That's all you need. I've then trailed my particles. So it's got a trail length of 2. Added some VDBs, which you can see here. Voxel size 0.05. Point radius scale of 0.09. Smooth them out with a filter radius of 2. Reshaped them just a little bit, so dilated them just a bit, and converted them to polygons. And that's how you kind of get the general shape of the beam over time. So you can see it going down and kind of getting bigger. And you can speed up this. My simulation is over 120 frames. In real production standpoint, a beam is going to pick up a character a lot faster, so it's probably going to be under 2 seconds. So you'll probably want to speed up the sim a little bit if you do it one of 2 ways. So now jumping down here, you can see the one of 2 ways it's going to start to happen. So the pop over here is just our generic pop simulation. So you can scroll through and just kind of let it play back, which is fun. But then if we jump over here, you can see I've done something a little bit sneaky. So what I've done is selected the keyframes of my simulation that I like. So we have our starting point. So this is the first frame where the beam touches the ground. Beam gets bigger, and now it's simming. Beam swallows person. And I apologize for the really loud ambulance in the back. Beam beams up person. And then the beam finishes. So then we have about 5 keyframes from the simulation that we can use. And I've added a switch so we can switch between them. And this is the thing I use. So it's just a simple Vex or H-script, whatever you want to call it, equation. So in between these keyframes, over the period of time, it will switch between them. So we can just do something like that. So if you wanted a more jagged approach to a beam up, you could do this. I've added a clip, and I'll explain why in a second. So when it gets to the first, you'll notice that because these are still frames, there's kind of no movement to them. So what I've done is I've added a little bit more animation on top of this. So what this is doing is it's taking the first keyframe, so this one, and it's clipping it. And it's moving down, so as the beam touches the ground, it will keep that position, and then it will like switch halfway through, and we'll get a little bit more fluidity in motion. So over here I've added a switch, so I can switch between the two versions that I like. So pop sim and also the still frames. Going down here, I've added another clip, and so this is to finish up the bottom half of the simulation. So when the beam is finished and it can go back to the spaceship, the clip just rises and sucks up all that good stuff. And that's pretty cool. I've also added a UV project because I want to texture this. So UV project was the best way possible to do this. And I've translated it, I've rotated it, I've scaled the UVs, and they seem to work. You get the general idea. They are there because I see them in the geometry spreadsheet. So they're there. They work. And then I attribute transferred something important onto our beam. If you are using the still frames up here, you will want to transfer the velocity from your pop sim back onto your mesh. And I find with Houdini, sometimes it doesn't work. So attribute transferring your velocity onto a still beam like this is probably a good idea if you want to make it look like it's in motion. You can see that we're on the still frames and the velocity trails are there. So it's grabbing them from this beautiful pop sim right up here with the trails. That's where I'm grabbing it. That's all it's transferring. Didn't change anything else. Down here I've done something a little bit sneaky. So I decided I wanted more animation on my beam. So I added a point fop, and I really like this point fop, and I'll explain in a minute. So those are the settings that I did. You can see that I've gotten the displacement to move over the offset of time by adding a negative t. So it's moving down or up depending on what you want. Adjusted the frequency, the roughness, and the amplitude. Diving inside the point fop, all it is an anti-alias noise plugged into the position, a fit, a displacement amount along the normal. So depending on how you adjust your normals will be how this is affected. And then it's plugged into the position of the geometry output. And that's pretty much it. And then I remeshed everything. And this might take a little while depending on your computer because remesh is kind of weird. And then I took beam out. So this is the main beam. It's pretty simple. I hope you like it. Down here, we've done something a little bit more sneaky. So this is where the glow on the ground comes in. So you can see it, but it's a little bit trickier because you want it to grow over time. The way you can do that is through, again, attribute transfers. So I've colored my beam red. I've gone down to my attribute transfer, and I'm transferring the color onto the grid we created above. So you can see it's the same grid that is being brought in through the object merge. So the second reason I added a null to the ground plane was so we could grab it down here. So this re-importing it down here, we're remeshing it again so we can get better detail. Added a color, which is black. Gone to my attribute transfer and made it grab the color. This can be a little bit tricky because you don't want a wide radius when you first grab your color because it's going to look like this. You don't want that. So trim it down as much as possible so it's surrounding the beam itself, and then blur the attributes. So you can see the color is kind of spread out just a little bit, but it's still retaining the shape of where the beam touches ground. Then delete it. Delete everything that you don't need. So choose all the points in the ground, go delete by expression, and use this formula. So already, if you skim through your timeline, you should see this kind of glowy pattern appear on your ground plane. And that's kind of how you do it. now I'm deleting all the attributes I don't need, which is CD, making sure the normals are correct, coloring this again to be black, coloring this white, which is our beam again, attribute transferring this onto there, and you might be wondering what the heck I'm doing. I am creating a kind of disbursement effect of the glow through color. So this secondary color transfer is to help better connect any alpha channels we have with the geometry. So over here, I've once again blurred the color so you can see that we've got black around the edges and white in the center, and I've added an emit. So what this is going to do is just closer to the edges, not emit anything, and kind of be opaque towards the center. And this is kind of what I used for it, and it works great. So if you want to change where the glow is positioned on the thing, you can adjust it like this, make it bigger or smaller. It's really up to you. And then we've got our ground out glow, and now we can jump to our surface. So our render ground glow is grabbing our out ground glow that we just showed at the bottom of our node tree. You dive in here, the beam is getting sampled from the beam out, and the person is just a generic test geometry. So that's pretty much it. And I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. My name is Kate, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!